I'm a social psychologist, so my training is in sort of experimental social psychology, and my focus of my research is on sex and well-being and relationship well-being. So I really focus on how couples can have better relationships and sex lives, and I tend to do this by taking an individual difference approach. So often looking at things like attachment styles or your mindset towards sex and how that affects your relationships.
Our relationships are so foundational to, from my understanding, our well-being altogether, our
Yes,
health.
yes.
How much do things like attachment styles or sexual
Mm.
preferences play into our ability to have a deeply connected and healthy relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially when it concerns attachment styles, because I think we kind of know anyone who knows anything about attachment styles knows that they're often referred to as like secure or insecure. And I think that can kind of scare people. And if they think that, okay, well, I'm insecure, does that mean I'm doomed? And definitely not, right? So I think things like attachment and individual differences and personality traits do shape a lot of our relationship satisfaction, but there's always ways to work to improve your relationship. So I'm someone who takes a really like growth mindset towards your relationship and your sex life, always thinking you could work and put an effort to improve. So I think we can often overcome some of our vulnerabilities, especially if we get into a relationship with a good, secure partner. I've done some work kind of on I call it sexual mindset, the idea of whether you think you need to work hard to improve your sex life or whether you think it'll just be sort of predestined, or like if you just find a good partner or a sexual soulmate and you're compatible, then things will work out. So, what I've seen is that people who are more willing to have that growth mindset towards sex, they tend to have better relationships and sex lives because they communicate better about sex. They're more willing to do things like say, oh, yeah, I'll consider my partner's sexual needs in the bedroom. So they tend to reap higher, relationship and sexual satisfaction even during difficult times. So I'd say that's kind of my main focus when I'm thinking about sexual well-being is kind of contrasting people's beliefs or mindsets about whether they think they need to work on it or not.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Like,
Oh, thanks.
if we
Yeah.
look at our sexuality, like this is something that we need to improve, like the way we need to
Yes.
improve our bodies going to the gym. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like,
Yes, exactly.
no, because I think most of us do kind of have this, well, it is what it is. And,
Yes. Yeah.
so I've been conducting interviews of live Jasmin models, live Jasmin members,
Nice.
Maxwell
Yes.
experts like yourself. And I've conducted a few interviews like this, but just last week I interviewed a man who uses the site with his wife. And
Oh, amazing.
yes,
Yes.
they really feel like it's almost like a fun and almost safer way to add variety
Yeah.
relationship without actually bringing someone in. It's like
Yes.
with a
Yes.
professional, and
Yes.
he was saying that it's like their adventure together and it brings them closer.
Oh my gosh, 1,000%. I love that idea. And like, I love to hear that because for so many reasons, right? We know trying new things with our partner, and it doesn't have to be in the bedroom, but in the bedroom is great, that can really um, increase our closeness to our partner and increase our passion. So doing new things with your partner is so important to kind of break up the rut we can get in a long-term relationship, because when you do something new and like something like that is obviously very novel, you're going to see another side of your partner. You kind of it's almost like falling in love again because you're like, oh, like I've never seen this side of them and this trait or this skill that they have, and so it really kind of, yeah, it can increase the passion. And I also really love that they were doing it together. I'm not sure if anyone else has spoken about, there's research showing that when couples use porn together, for instance, it's better for their relationship than them doing it on their own. And so I think I love this idea of it being kind of like another tool in couples' tool chest that they can use to increase the intimacy and kind of switch things up. And like you're saying too, I can see how it would be kind of a potentially more safe option for people, and something that feels less vulnerable. And I'm sure too, with things like, couples often worry about jealousy if they're bringing someone else into the relationship. And at least with this, that like the communication is mediated. It's not like they're going to be able to text that person
Yeah.
right after.
Yeah, it's controlled communication. One thing he said, which a lot of other members have said, but they're in different situations than him. Like he said that
Right.
his wife, he and the model will sometimes like play games, or she'll, teach them
Oh,
about,
interesting.
yeah, and like
Yeah,
about a bunch of different things. And he enjoyed that. But there are members who have either a disability or they're newly
of
divorced
course.
and
Yes.
just don't
Yeah.
want the drama of a relationship, but they're needing that connection.
Yeah.
Talk to
Yeah.
me about that. Like they're seeking it out with the model because
Right.
they're
Right.
still craving it. Um, what are your thoughts around this dynamic of model and member? What is the connection? Is it fulfilling?
Yeah.
Can it be fulfilling? Are there drawbacks? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, it's such an interesting question and something that, to my knowledge, like hasn't been really tested too much. It makes me think of a couple different pieces of research, and some of it is that we do know that people can feel a lot less lonely by connecting with someone, even if it's kind of a one-sided relationship. And so I'm not saying like this necessarily is, but even for instance, people can feel less lonely and less rejected when they watch TV shows with their favorite characters, or think of a pet, or think of, or a celebrity that they're attached to. So I definitely see that that makes sense that people who maybe like have just gone through a divorce would want to be seeking connection. And I think it can really like satisfy some of your intimacy needs and your need to belong, right? And I think also there's people for whom, maybe they have too much going on in their life. And like you're saying, they just, research backs that up. A lot of times when people pay for sex, it's because they don't want the trouble of a relationship, and it's easy and it's less, yeah, less drama, really. It's pretty much what the research says in so many words, right? And I love that you mentioned people with disabilities, because I think these people often they do get overlooked just in terms of sexual research and just our discussion of sex in society. And so I think that this is a great way that they can get some of their intimacy needs met and some of their sexual needs met. And we know from a lot of other research on computer mediated communication, or just like chatting online, that people can feel really satisfied with these interactions, and especially if self-disclosure is happening, which my sense is happens a lot in these situations, right? That you are sharing things about your life, and so I think you can form a bond and feel like your belongingness needs are met. I'd say the only drawback that I see is that, because at the end of the day, it is still a bit of a transaction. I would worry about potentially people who are over relying on it and like never seeing anyone in person, or not seeking out any options in the real world, and just kind of getting overly focused on maybe one model or something like that. But overall, I think it can be a great way for people to, yeah, to meet their connection needs. And I'm sure, like, I always think of how during the pandemic, I think one of the great, it was shit times, should be very clear about that, but one of the great things that came out of I think people realized how we need to be taking loneliness and social connection so seriously. And people were saying things like, I miss just chatting with a barista, and I miss, just my normal interactions. Like, even if there's somewhat brief interactions, they're so important. And so that's why I think for anyone to be able to have this as another way to meet some of those connection needs can be really important if they're isolated for any reason.
You know, through my work doing these interviews, I think that's when
Yeah.
the the issue with members who have disabilities became very highlighted, because I
Yes.
interviewed so many of them. And I mean, these are people that cannot leave their home without assistance. They're in a wheelchair,
Yes.
whatever the case is.
Yeah.
There was one guy in particular, it's really interesting. I interviewed one of the top cam models in the world.
Yeah.
She recommended interviewing one of her members. So I did.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
He was in a wheelchair. And at the end of the interview, he told me about this great relationship they've had for like 10 years or
Oh my
something.
gosh.
And you
Yeah.
want to know something? I've never seen her without her clothes on.
Wow.
Their
Wow. Yeah.
relationship had been completely platonic the whole time.
The whole time. That is crazy. And that's like, to me, that also, like, yeah, that's such a cool story in so many ways. And I think one of the things that that also highlights is how there is a need. Like, I feel like it's so unfortunate in some ways that this person had to kind of pay for friend. It's like I feel like we need to, as society, be better at reaching to like folks with disabilities, because they're being forgotten. But I think that's so beautiful that he was able to use this service to get that connection and find like a really fulfilling relationship. And that just speaks to it too, like 10 years, right? It is like it is a relationship.
Absolutely. And for her too, I mean, she's the one who recommended him to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, it's clear
People
there's
on her mind.
mutual,
Yeah.
yeah, mutual respect there too. It's not like, I'm sure she's viewing him as a human, as a friend, and not just as like a client.
I want to ask you, you are a professional. You're an expert.
Right, right.
You
Yes.
do deal with topics of intimacy and sexuality. Do you yourself, because I know in this industry, I mean, the stigma is out of, it's just
Yes,
on
yeah.
another level still. I'm curious, even for you, are you having those challenges of stigma, of judgment because you're talking
Mm.
about sexuality at all? Or is it not quite as bad?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like definitely not as bad as say like a cam girl would get, but there still is way more stigma than there should be. I think that first of all, relationship science is not taken that seriously, and like even within relationship science, studying sex is seen as more fringe. So definitely, I think there's people who think you can't study it scientifically. I see like a lot of, I'd say I don't get very much like overt stigma, but I think there's some subtle, right? And there's definitely, there'll be the offhand sexist comment that I get about my research that someone else studying something else wouldn't, right? Or, what I think is fascinating is at a big conference, say of psychology, if I have a poster about sex and relationships, someone will come up and just start telling me their personal experience and kind of not really treat me the same way they would an expert in prejudice or attitudes, right? Like they just want to share. It's like, okay, but like that's cool, but I also did like this really fancy study and these amazing things that I would love to tell you about, like the science and not just that. And there even is some research showing too that like people who study, say, open relationships, they are like people do stigmatize them and assume they're in open relationships and things like that. So I do presumably, I would assume that people assume sex scientists are more promiscuous than we truly are. Data from studies like conferences of sex researchers show that we really just have more liberal attitudes. We don't always have more liberal behaviors or more casual sex or anything like that. We just have more open attitudes. So I definitely think that we still have a long way to go in terms of the scientific community taking sex research seriously. Yeah, I'm sure I could give you 1,000 examples too of how like, people will make fun of, even if the media does pick up any of our research, oftentimes even if the journalist is responsible, there'll be trolls, right, who think like this was a waste of taxpayers' money or things like that. I don't know if any of the other experts have already spoke to you about like the need to belong, but there was essentially in the late 90s, there was this like big paper that argues exactly what you said. And it says like our need for human connection is as fundamental as our need for food or water. And when we're deprived of that need, we suffer. And we really just, yeah, like we need close connections. We have this need. And so I think you're spot on in saying like it's not something trivial and we can survive without other things like money or status, but close relationships, they are in our DNA. I always say that to people, like we come from a long line of people for whom they were successful at close relationships, they reproduced. We've as a society continued because we were forming relationships and helping each other out. So no, I think you give them the right advice. Yeah, nurture close relationships. And I love too that I think increasingly we're getting a better understanding of how like our relationships don't have to just be like me and my partner. Like it's also important to nurture all those other close friendships. And you can kind of sometimes spread your needs across different people, and that can be really effective as well.
I think
Um,
it's important to do.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if, again, if people have already spoke about this, but I love a recent theory that talks about too how now in society, our close relationships are more meaningful and important to us than ever before. But simultaneously, we're actually on average investing less in them because we're so busy with work. And we tend to often only see our partner and not our siblings or our community or things like that. And so it's so important for us to actually be nurturing our relationships, because if we have these high expectations that marriage needs to be everything or our relationships need to be everything and self-actualize us and do all these things, then we need to start really caring about how we can improve them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is so to like pull it back, I'm curious because
Yeah.
what I'm seeing in society and culture and our culture is that we have this crazy thing, this ancient thing where we shun sexuality, right? And intimacy
Yes.
connection. I mean, that there's no question there. But what's fascinating is like we only shun parts of it. You know what I mean? So
Hmm. Hmm.
let's take Instagram as our case study here. Instagram
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
allow a lot of sexual photos from a lot of Instagram models. But if a
Yeah.
sexual educator like yourself comes on and says the word, you're going to get
Yeah. Then we're going to get blocked. We're still, as a society, not as comfortable as we need to be with talking about sex. And I wonder if part of that is a lack of education. So, especially in America, there's a very much a need for comprehensive sexual education. And I think, I guess, it's just at the end of the day is something that people just still see as like impure and immoral. And we still have a lot of these kind of antiquated ideas that sex should be for marriage and not something openly talked about. I do think that some of it must just have to be kind of learned stigma, like social learning that like early on, kids are taught like don't, kids get shamed for their sexuality from day one. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in future generations as we continue to become more sexually liberal. I don't know if anyone's spoken to you about what I find fascinating. One trend is that even though our attitudes are becoming more liberal over time, like the youth these days are actually having less sex. So teens are waiting longer to have sex and teen pregnancy rates are lower. And so I feel like on the one hand, we can see this as a great sign. That's great that they're not having, teen pregnancy rates are down. That's great. But if they're not having sex, part of me wonders if that's because they're not comfortable. They're still like, it's still maybe seen as taboo, or they're not comfortable experimenting and things like that. So yeah, yeah. If you get to the bottom of exactly why we're all still hung up on sex, like please let me know.
A model recently said something that I found really interesting because I asked her, do her friends and family know what she does? How does she deal with the stigma?
Right, right.
And her response was, yeah, like her mom knows and her mom's fine with it. So she's kind of like, if that person to me is okay, then, you can
Yeah,
put your judgment elsewhere. But she said, I don't believe that women are naturally shameful about this work. She was like,
no.
we're taught to feel shame about our
Yes.
sexuality.
Yeah. 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 I think that like, right. And I mean, I think if we think of that too, right, how there are some cultural differences and even like Europeans are much more comfortable with their bodies and things like that. Then so I feel like I completely agree. I think it's very learned that it's societal, society's impinging on this and teaching us that it's not cool. And specifically, I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you said it's women's sexuality that's shamed. So I think as much as we have made gains, over time, like one thing that's important to remind people that I always tell my students is the sexual double standard is still alive and well. So people always test every few years to be like, yeah, is it still the case that like women are shamed for sex and casual sex and men aren't? And it's always like, yep, still there. So unfortunately, like you're saying, it's like very much this idea that women are shamed for their sexuality. And I think like, for a long history, there's a long history of the world just trying to control women's bodies and sexuality.
Yeah, it's almost like we hit like our growth was stumped somewhere in regards to
Yeah,
maturity for sexuality and intimacy because it's still like a very immature view. Part of
yeah,
why even
yeah,
this work for me has become so interesting is because now at this point, I've interviewed hundreds of people, models and members who have told me, wow, camming got me through a really hard time. Like I was
yeah.
a member was considering taking his life and he needed
Oh
someone,
no.
needed a,
Yeah, to talk to.
as we know, men aren't as
Yeah.
comfortable going to therapy as women. That is a fact,
Yeah. Yeah. That is a fact. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
And
and also too, men don't have as many close connections in their everyday life, right? So that's established as well. But like men's friendship, men's friendships, it's a lot of like talking, not to stereotype, but like research supports, it's a lot of talking about sports and things, and not like your deep, deep feelings. So
that
yeah,
that is so true. Absolutely. Like we will call up a girlfriend and it's like she could be a mediocre friend, not even our best friend. And we're telling her
yes, yeah,
exactly what happened with our husband last night. You know what I mean? Like
exactly,
through the lens of attachment styles, I'm curious,
yeah.
how would you look at camming?
Ooh, yeah, that would be. Ooh, I was like, maybe we could collaborate on a study. I don't know if
Oh, we
anyone
would
has
love that.
done.
We would love
Yeah,
that.
honestly, that would be so cool. Because I was gonna say, like, I'm not sure if there's anyone who has looked at this directly, because I could see a couple different. I could see a couple of different things, right? I could see more avoidant people liking it because it's uh, a very autonomous, independent thing. And it's a way to like get connection without having the strings attached. So it reminds me of how avoidant people like casual sex. And in theory, they say they'd like an open relationship, but I know they wouldn't, because they wouldn't actually like the communication and the stuff like that. So I could see avoidant people being drawn to it for that reason, and it potentially being a good way to kind of even maybe improve their beliefs about others, because it's like that person is always there for them. It's reliable. And on the other hand, I could also see more anxious folks wanting to use it just to have a form of connection. And again, that reliability. So it would be interesting to see, because I could kind of come up with competing perspectives as to the attachment style of those who are more likely to use it. And I think what's kind of interesting to think about as well is whether people are using these as like a substitute for face-to-face relationships, or like an added bonus, right? Or maybe like a time where you're using it, to supplement your face-to-face relationships. I was thinking ahead of this, I kind of was making sure I like thought of some studies, and like there is research on attitudes towards sex work and lots of work on sex workers, but there's also a little bit on transactional sex and like some older stuff on phone sex, but there's really nothing that kind of to me captures, from talking to you, like what seems like a really unique specific type of medium that's not really captured, because it's like we can draw analogies to porn and analogies to other things, but not, yeah, it's not exactly the same thing.
Exactly. Absolutely.
One of my many general things that I like to do is try to dispel a lot of myths from the media and society about sex and relationships, just to help people realize that it doesn't always need to be as complicated as we think. And I think that's what drew me to this line of work originally. So I originally got into this because I realized that people don't talk openly about sex, and oftentimes don't talk very genuinely about relationships and relationship struggles. And so I think if we can keep doing more research to understand how people can have better relationships and make that known to people and get the research out there, I think that's so important, because relationships and sexuality are literally in our DNA. We all came from people who reproduced, who had close relationships. So we really need to make sure that we continue to nurture these relationships. Yeah.
I think it's incredible what you're doing because exactly, I think we're at the very beginning of that phase where I think people are waking up and we're realizing we need intimacy, we need relationships. And the only way to really move things forward is to have conversation around it that's factual and scientific based, and
Yes.
not
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
well, I read this in the magazine, like
Yeah.
um and to educate people because I think you're right, it does really start with getting educated and comfortable. It's like, what is it, exposure, not shock exposure, but
Yeah. Are you thinking of like exposure therapy or
exposure
yeah,
therapy. That's
yes,
what we
yes,
need with
yeah. Yes.
sexuality.
I agree. I agree. It's like just keep exposing people. Eventually we'll realize it doesn't need to be anxiety provoking. Nothing crazy is gonna happen. Yeah, no, I agree.
What are your thoughts around connection in the digital age? Is it good for us? Is it not good for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And such a loaded question, right? It's a difficult one to answer, because I think there's so many benefits of it, right? And I think, like you're saying too, there's so many ways in which it does mimic real world face-to-face communication. I think it's great that we're able to do business that way and friendships that way. So many great things about connecting people. I think that people can feel really satisfied, especially if they're disclosing and acting authentic in them. Um, Having said that, I think there is something still special with like physical connection sometimes with being touched. And, we can think about hormones and things like that. So I do think that digital communication you know, can't completely replace in person, face to face, but I think it can do like 90% of the job, and especially in terms of making us feel less lonely and forming bonds. We can 1,000% do that digitally. And there's so much research showing that, you can really, really form good bonds online. And I think it's just great that now we have so much access to a wider variety of people. And that can include helping us find people who have similar interests, even if they're really niche, right? We can think of that in terms of sexuality as well, finding people with a niche sexual preference as you. So I think there's really overall so many benefits, but I think it would be remiss for me not to mention that I do think there is sometimes still something special about face to face. And I guess the last thing I'll add though, what's great about digital communication, like camming or like Zoom, like when you have video cues as well as audio cues, you're still able to get a lot of the things like facial expressions and gestures, and you could read people a lot better than say if it was just like over the phone or something like that. So definitely, I think the video communication can do a good job of giving us a lot of the cues that we would get face to face.
My final question is, how do
Yeah.
we, in your opinion, create a more sex positive society?
Ooh, yes. I think one of the first things is to start, I think it starts young. I think it starts with how we communicate to our children about our bodies and about sex, of course, in an age appropriate way. But I think it's like we really do have to start early and start having more positive messages about sex from the get-go. I think we're seeing some positive shifts in the media with greater diversity and more sex positivity. So I think we need to continue to see more of that. So I love that there's more inclusive and more sex positive TV shows than when I was growing up, for instance. I think the other big piece is comprehensive sex ed, just helping people realize that sex isn't scary. You don't necessarily need to abstain unless you want to, things like that. And I think really like that comes from people being comfortable with their own sexuality, right? Because you're not going to feel comfortable talking to your kid about sex or advocating for comprehensive sex ed unless you yourself feel more open and honest about your sex life. So I think society's trending in the right direction, especially in terms of our attitudes getting more sexually liberal over time. We've seen stigma go down against things like casual sex or LGBTQ identities. We're starting to maybe see less stigma towards open relationships. So I think it can be done. I think it's just often a slow thing. And so I think future generations are going to be more sex positive as long as we keep doing these things. But I think we could do a lot more to get there quicker. And I really think it is like work on yourself, be sex positive, and then spread that message to your partners and to your children.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
I was like, I hope that
Yeah.
makes sense.
No, I
That's at least what I think. I don't know. I'm sure other people have better answers, but yeah, that was a really good question. I saw that on the sheet of ones and I was like, oh, dang, like if I had the answer.
well,
Yeah, I
that's,
wish.
every expert's response that I've asked that has been the same overall message and point.
Is it? Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Is it just kind of like get more happy yourself and then start young or
Well,
like better sex ed?
your get help yourself was an added new thing that I think is important, that
Yeah.
people haven't talked about, but it's like continue these conversations, start with a
Yeah.
comprehensive sexual education. That's like the main point
Yes.
that you
Yeah, it really
like
is.
work on yourself and heal yourself, which you have that component in
Yeah.
attachment styles, like that is
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm excited to like hear too. I'm gonna have to check out when all the videos are up, like just also other people's answers. I feel like it would be great. And also a cool resource for my class, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, because I teach like next week. So this week's attachment styles, next week's like online communication and online dating. And so like it will be cool eventually to be able to like show them some of these videos and say, like, oh yeah, see, like I'm not the only one who says that like online communication's great. Like here are some other experts saying some things. So yeah, because I think it's such a cool, yeah, opportunity. And I really applaud you guys for doing this whole study and kind of interviewing all these people to get like a better understanding of what's going on. It's gonna provide a much more nuanced discussion, which I think is great, right? Like, much beyond people just saying, oh, like camming, whatever, it's awesome.
Because it's so much camming is kind of like our door in, but it's so much deeper than that. It's the intimacy, the
Yeah,
really like this
exactly.
their website is in the business of connection. And the Kinsey
Yes. Yeah.
study, they saw that the girls who were making the most money, and I mean, this is ridiculous money, uh,
Yeah.
they weren't really doing anything explicit.
Which I think is
It's like just,
fascinating.
yeah, that those
Yeah.
the higher,
Yeah.
longer time and more money of just like day-to-day connection. Hey, how was your day? Let's have coffee together. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Her had been with a model for 10 years, never once saw her without her top off.
Yeah. That's crazy. That's awesome. I'm like, oh, okay, side hustle ideas. No, I'm kidding. I'm
Oh,
kidding. I
really?
don't have
Really?
time. I was like, I don't have time for that. I really have time for my real job. But honestly,
It's
yeah.
really a
So
$1 billion industry, and for a reason, because people, and that's another part, like I want people to start picking up on too, and maybe you can use some
yeah,
study. Why are people so deprived of connection that like
yeah. And it's not even really about sex. Yeah. It's like,
sex? Yeah.
yeah, that's fascinating to hear because I honestly think, and I think that is different from the older research on like phone sex and stuff like that, right? Because in there it was like maybe like 15% of people who said it was for company and like things like that. But like it really, so to me, I do think that something has changed and people are really feeling not connected.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lonely. People are feeling low.
Yeah.
And that's kind of
Yes.
what I think I would love for people to start looking at. And so for us, we are like, we have seen the trends within the company. So we're like, okay,
Yes.
why don't we
Yeah.
have experts like get involved? Why don't we have the models say what's
Yes.
happening? Why don't we have the members say what's happening? You know what I mean? And let's move this.
Yes, that's so cool. Yes, yeah, yeah, and kind of beyond like the stereotype of what people think.
Right.
Yeah, which I think is fascinating. So cool. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
This
So
was
I
so much fun. And you asked great questions, by the way. That's what I was going to say. You have like a really keen insight into this. Yeah, and made me think of some good things. So
thank you so
yeah,
much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
awesome.
Bye.